Paris, the 22nd of May, 1799. 10 chaotic years have passed since the advent of the French Revolution. Massive changes have swept over France repeatedly, and each new political innovation has come with its own set of challenges. While radicalism has largely receded, the economy is faltering, and the financial ruin that caused the revolution in the first place has yet to be settled. Instead, the people flock to the newspapers. Though unstable and broke, France has managed to take on all of Europe in battle and win, in no small part due to the unparalleled achievements of the young general Napoleon Bonaparte, whose streak of military successes has continued in faraway Egypt and Syria. Suddenly, La Gazette Nationale, France's main newspaper, issues a stunning bulletin. While fighting to secure the ancient city of Acre, General Bonaparte has raised an army of local Jews to re-establish the ancient kingdom of Judea. The new Jewish army is already marching on Aleppo. There's only one problem. None of that is true. Not only has Bonaparte's Syrian campaign already been defeated, but neither he, nor his advisors, nor any military or government records show any intention to establish a Jewish state. La Gazette Nationale has been duped. So, why did they think it was true? During the Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte had quickly advanced through the ranks of France's newly egalitarian army, mostly putting down royalist uprisings. In 1796, while fighting for its survival against almost all of Europe, France's ruling government sought to break the will of the opposing First Coalition by invading Austria and knocking them out of the war. While the main assault through southern Germany crashed and burned, Bonaparte's invasion of northern Italy, which had originally been intended purely as a diversionary tactic, succeeded in defeating Austria and bringing about a relative peace. A native of Corsica, with close cultural ties to Italy, General Bonaparte consolidated power during the war by establishing pro-revolutionary client governments in the occupation zone, and encouraging pro-French revolutions beyond, including the Papal States, who had been supporting Austria. Having already captured the Po Valley from the papacy, in February 1797 he continued south, occupying the strategic port city of Ancona, and this is where our story really gets started. As in most of northern Italy, Jews in the Papal States were confined to ghettos. Now, when I say ghetto, you might just be imagining an ethnic enclave created by discriminatory housing laws, but these ghettos were quite a bit more extreme than that. These neighborhoods were completely walled off and rarely expanded to accommodate population growth. Thousands of Jews of all economic status were packed into areas rarely larger than 1 or 2 city blocks, in often derelict and unsanitary conditions, and were forbidden from leaving at night under lock and key. On top of that, the Papal States enforced some of the harshest and most arcane restrictions against Jews in Western Europe. Despite significant improvements in relations with Jewish authorities elsewhere on the continent, Pope Pius VI treated the Jews of the Papal States as his personal property. He had revived the medieval law requiring them to wear identifying clothing, banned them from practicing any trade besides selling clothes, and routinely ordered police to raid the ghettos and abduct Jewish children to be raised in the Catholic Church. With Ancona's ghetto located right at the entrance to the city, this was the first thing Bonaparte saw upon his arrival. After being informed by some of his Jewish soldiers who these people were and what they were doing, Bonaparte ordered the ghettos to be closed, and for all restrictions against the Jews to be lifted. With this, rabbis gave speeches in praise of France, women sang, men danced, and the yellow badge imposed by the Pope was replaced by the revolutionary tricolor. By the end of the year, every ghetto in Italy under French occupation had been abolished. By 1798, France's only remaining enemy was Great Britain, whose vast colonial empire and naval dominance would prove almost impossible to overcome. So in order to undermine British access to supplies in their Indian colonies, the French Directory sent 50,000 men under Bonaparte to assert French dominance in the Mediterranean by seizing control of Malta and then Egypt. For nearly 4 centuries by this point, Malta had been ruled by the Knights Hospitaller, a Catholic military order left over from the Crusades. Over those 4 centuries, the Knights had developed a practice of raiding Ottoman ports and merchant ships and taking the ensuing captives, mostly Muslims and Jews, as slaves, either to be put to use as servants, ransomed, or sold back to mainlanders on the black market. In June 1798, Bonaparte arrived in Malta and began besieging the islands, leading to an uprising of both slaves and commoners within the country. Just 2 days into the siege, the knights surrendered and slavery was abolished, further boosting Bonaparte's reputation among Europe's Jews. Landing in Alexandria on the 1st of July, Napoleon made 2 declarations. First to his soldiers, demanding that they be on their best behavior and respect the local customs and religions, and second to the people of Egypt, proclaiming that he was a friend of Islam who had defeated the Pope and the Knights of Malta and had come to establish a strong, independent, and free Egypt. Once in control of the region, this is the philosophy by which he administered it. Dhimma was abolished, and Jews and Christians were emancipated. But that administration was precarious. Locals largely resented the new taxes needed to keep paying the French army and desired a return to Ottoman rule. The British under Lord Nelson had sunk the French fleet and were now teaming up with the Ottomans to retake Egypt, compelling Bonaparte to meet their advance in Greater Syria. Now, whereas the Egyptian campaign had been highly disciplined and PR conscious, the Syrian campaign was an uncompromising total war. Having already brutally suppressed pro-French uprisings in Damascus, Ottoman governor Ahmad al-Jazar summarily executed Bonaparte's emissaries and impaled their heads at the gates of the strategic port of Jaffa. As revenge, when the French captured Jaffa in March 1799, Bonaparte had the entire Ottoman garrison wiped out, including around 3,000 prisoners of war. The actions at Jaffa were the worst atrocities of Bonaparte's entire military career, and they only strengthened Ottoman resistance. By capturing the port of Acre, Bonaparte believed that he could incite a full-scale rebellion across Syria and create a permanent ally in the Middle East. But despite some early successes and superior numbers, what he had expected to be a 2-week siege lasted 2 months. Ultimately, the British Navy under Commodore Sidney Smith and the Ottoman garrison under the Jewish general Chaim Farchi held out, and Bonaparte was forced to retreat back to Egypt. The very next day, the Gazette Nationale issued the article claiming that Bonaparte had proclaimed his desire to establish a Jewish state. Now, I've already said that this was almost certainly untrue. Neither Bonaparte himself nor any French officers or government officials ever recorded such an intention. But it's pretty clear based on Bonaparte's previous military adventures why it would be credible. In fact, such an idea had been a persistent rumor among Syria's Jews throughout the campaign, which is why it was probably reported to Constantinople and then Paris as fact, a source of great frustration to Farchi. Additionally, Irish Republicans living in France had frequently promoted Jewish statehood out of solidarity with the Irish struggle against British domination. But there's no evidence that the idea of Jewish statehood was any more than rumor and wishful thinking. Bonaparte's intentions for the Jewish people were to be free and productive citizens wherever they may live. By the time French administration in Egypt collapsed in 1801, Bonaparte had long since returned to France, staged a coup, and made himself first consul. Finally, in 1804, he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. And while this is often seen as the end of the French Revolution, many of the initial revolutionary reforms remained in place, including freedom of religion and the emancipation of the Jews. It's often debated whether Napoleon had ever been a true believer in the revolution, or whether he cynically exploited it to expand his own power and the power of France as a whole. And this is no less true of his treatment of Jews. Towards the end of his life, Napoleon gave an explanation of his Jewish policy that comes off as generally principled and altruistic, and matches up with how most of Europe's Jews viewed him during his reign.
By putting them upon an equality with Catholics, Protestants, and others, I hope to make them become good citizens and conduct themselves like others of the community. I should have drawn great wealth to France, as the Jews are very numerous and would have flocked to a country where they enjoyed such superior privileges. Moreover, I wanted to establish a universal liberty of conscience.
But when he wrote that, Napoleon was already defeated and imprisoned, so this could have been some serious revisionism intended to shore up his legacy. At other times, he went out of his way to say terrible things about Jews for the benefit of conservative family members and allies, but we'll come back to that. The best contemporary insight we have into Napoleon's views on religion and ethnic minorities comes from his time in Egypt. which suggests that his interest in Jews was self-serving but still well-intentioned. Even if Napoleon didn't particularly care about Jews, he absolutely loved them as an insurance policy to secure his political legacy. A people once liberated will not easily be returned to the ghetto, so even if his empire failed, its spirit would not. This had already been borne out in Egypt. Though he eventually led the campaign to chase the French out of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha had been an early supporter of Napoleon's administration there, and copied it just a few years later, when he transformed the region into a de facto independent state. But at the same time, people who've been ostracized and persecuted for centuries are generally not equipped to integrate into mainstream society from day one. Suffice it to say that where the first generation of French revolutionaries regarded Jewish emancipation as a fait accompli, Napoleon saw the need for a more proactive approach. And such a proposal emerged in 1805, when the Alsatian Jewish politician Ber Isaac Ber and veteran human rights activist Abbot Henri Gregoire presented religious minister Portali with a comprehensive and quite radical plan for Jewish modernization. We'll get to the details of the plan later on. The only question right now was whether Jewish community leaders would be willing to accept it. Thus far, every country that had successfully emancipated its Jews had done so against the will of rabbinic courts, since it completely removed their power to police and enforce Jewish law. The exception to this had been the United States, which didn't have any rabbis to begin with. On the one hand, the Jews under Napoleon's domains had already been emancipated, so local rabbis didn't have anything to gain by opposing his new plans. But on the other hand, Napoleon knew so little about Judaism that he didn't even know who to reach out to. In early 1806, Napoleon tasked Portali with arranging a meeting with the supreme leader of the Jewish religion, only to be informed that no such person existed. Most countries with Jewish populations did have national rabbinates headed by a chief rabbi, but France was not one of them, owing to historic divisions within the community pre-revolution. Portali did tell Napoleon that Judaism had once had a universal governing body, the Great Sanhedrin, but it hadn't met in 1450 years. And this gave Napoleon an idea. On the 30th of May, 1806, Napoleon issued a decree inviting over 100 Jewish notables of the empire to a meeting in Paris that would test the waters for future cooperation. Arriving in July, the emperor himself presented Assembly President Abraham Furtado with the following 12 questions. If you're familiar with Jewish law, you may notice that most of these questions don't have concrete yes or no answers. But the important thing to remember is that these questions specifically applied to Jewish law and practice in France at that time. Emancipation had given way to significant changes in how Jewish courts operated, and both Napoleon and the Jewish notables themselves wanted to take stock of what those changes were. Now, the men who attended this assembly basically comprised whoever wanted to come. There had never been a formal process for determining who was needed, so it included everyone from ultra-Orthodox rabbis to totally non-practicing politicians and businessmen. And even by the standards of Judaism, these fairly softball questions caused intense disagreement. Ultimately, Furtado gave the responsibility of formalizing their responses to the chief rabbi of Strasbourg, David Zinsheim. A brother-in-law of the late Herz Serfber, Zinsheim had actually worked extensively on the issue of emancipation during the French Revolution, and thus had a deep understanding of French secular politics. But he was also the most renowned Jewish scholar in the country, so altogether, no one was better equipped to communicate these complex religious ideas in a way that Napoleon could not only understand, but empathize with.
Is it lawful for Jews to marry multiple wives?
Technically, yes, said Zinsheim. But this hasn't been customary in France since the 11th century, so it's not a matter of national concern.
Does Judaism permit divorce?
Yes.
Can Jews and Christians marry under Jewish law?
Not under Jewish law, but there's nothing we can do to stop mixed couples from marrying in the secular courts.
How does Jewish law regard the practice of usury?
Usury is a mistranslation. Neshech in Hebrew refers to any type of interest. The correct term in Latin would be phenus. Usury is a pretty subjective term anyway, and have you ever noticed that, even though we have actual banks now, the term is still only applied to Jews?
Huh. What about police power? Do Jewish courts have that?
We used to, but not since emancipation.
But when you did, was that a commandment from God?
No, it was just a function of the pre-revolutionary legal system.
So what does it mean to be a Jew in France? Will the Jews fight for their country?
To the death. Thoroughly pleased with these answers, Napoleon ordered the Jewish notables to issue a general proclamation inviting 46 leading rabbis and 25 high-ranking Jewish laymen from France and the Kingdom of Italy to come to Paris and reconvene the Great Sanhedrin, with the purpose of ratifying Zinsheim's responses and clearing the way for a mutual agreement on Jewish modernization. The Sanhedrin convened on the 9th of February 1807, almost 4 months behind schedule, with Zinsheim elected as Nasi. But honestly, the Sanhedrin was little more than a formality for the Jews and a propaganda tool for Napoleon. It lasted barely more than 2 months and only confirmed the decisions that Zinsheim had already made during the Assembly of Jewish Notables. But it demonstrated to all of Europe that it was Napoleon, and only Napoleon, who would achieve Jewish emancipation with the consent of the rabbis. He could now move forward with the project of Jewish modernization. The goals of Jewish modernization were simple. It would create an organizational structure for France's Jews to address social and economic inequalities. It would encourage France's Jewish population to spread out geographically rather than remain overwhelmingly concentrated in Gascony and Alsace-Lorraine. And it would help France's Jews integrate into the national economy by encouraging Jewish participation in agriculture, manufacturing, and the military. To that end, on the 17th of March, 1808, Napoleon issued 2 decrees establishing the Israelite Central Consistory, modeled on the governing body of the French Reformed Church. Every French department with at least 2,000 Jews would be entitled to a synagogue and a local consistory, a governing body comprising a mix of rabbis, elected representatives, and appointed notables from the Jewish community. Importantly, any department whose Jewish population reached 2,000 in the future would also be eligible for a consistory of its own, thus encouraging France's Jews to spread more evenly throughout the country. In turn, these local consistories would establish the 5-member Central Consistory, which would manage Jewish communal property, ordain rabbis, pay the rabbis a fixed salary, and elect the chief rabbi of France, starting with Zinsheim. Let's be very clear. These consistories were not going to be like the rabbinates of old. They had no legal power to standardize or enforce Jewish religious practice. In fact, rules were set in place specifically to prevent the consistories from becoming totally dominated by religious officials. They actively required participation by wealthy business owners and secular politicians. This last point is what makes it so interesting to me that one of the very first champions of this plan had been the abbot Henri Gregoire. Prior to the revolution, Gregoire, like Malesherbes before him, had initially supported Jewish emancipation in part because he believed it would be a pathway for Jews to convert to Catholicism and assimilate completely into French Catholic society. However, his enthusiasm for the modernization plan makes it clear that this was no longer the case, since the consistories effectively tied wealthy and politically active Jews to their ancestral community by giving them an active stake in helping that community thrive. Christianization, at least in the French Empire, was no longer a mainstream consideration. However, Napoleon's overt abandonment of such old ideas alarmed the more conservative elements of his political circle, including members of his own family whom he'd appointed to major positions of power. Perhaps the fiercest reaction came from Emperor Alexander I of Russia, a French ally at the time, but also home to the most restrictive anti-Jewish laws in all of Europe. On his advice, the Russian Orthodox Church released a scathing condemnation of Napoleon's respect for Judaism as anti-Christian. Marshal Kellerman, one of the most important officers in the French army, advised Napoleon to not only abandon the project of Jewish modernization, but abolish Jewish emancipation. Whereas the emperor had sought to reassure his anti-Semitic family members, his response to Kellerman was uncompromising.
We must prevail in encouraging the Jews, who are only a very small minority amongst us, in the departments of the East, We find a great number of Jews that are very honest and industrious.
But the sheer amount of pushback nevertheless compelled Napoleon to temper his Jewish policy. Alongside the two decrees establishing the consistories, he also issued what came to be known as the Infamous Decree. Officially, this dictate voided any loans made by Jewish moneylenders to minors, women, or soldiers. Any private loan with an interest rate above 10% was voided, and all other loans were capped at 5%. Additionally, Jews could not open new businesses or borrow money without an explicit license from their municipal government and the local consistory. Jews living outside of Alsace were forbidden from moving there, and any move by Jews to a new department was contingent on purchasing land in order to take up farming. Finally, Jews were exempt from loopholes in France's military conscription law. Some historians have argued that the Grand Sanhedrin had just been a public spectacle for the people of Paris, that it was all for show. But that seems to be equally true of the Infamous Decree, a hollow attempt to placate conservative critics by imposing restrictions of little to no actual substance. Firstly, the traditional practice of money lending was almost extinct by this point, as emancipation 17 years earlier had freed up the Jewish population to take other jobs, and Napoleon's establishment of a modern central banking system had rendered it totally unnecessary. Secondly, the ban on Jews migrating to Alsace was not a problem. This was a period in which as many people as possible were leaving that region. Perhaps most importantly, Napoleon showed no intention whatsoever of enforcing or even upholding his decree. From the very start, it was set to expire after 10 years, and the Jews of Gascony were completely exempt from any of its rules. Within a matter of weeks, Napoleon had issued further dictates voiding the decree in most of the empire, and within 4 years it had effectively been repealed. 4 months after the first 3 decrees, Napoleon issued a fourth, requiring all Jews without surnames to adopt one. This is a pretty minor decree, and it mirrors similar laws that were popping up all over Europe, but people would probably get annoyed if I didn't mention it. So, with all that said, did Jewish modernization work? Yes, it was an overwhelming success. What I haven't mentioned until now is that Jewish modernization went hand in hand with a whole mess of economic reforms that Napoleon had introduced to address the root causes of the revolution and bring France up to speed with the rest of Western Europe. Being constantly at war severely limited which sectors of the economy could grow, but as long as the war wasn't being fought in France, that wasn't so much of a problem. And by the end of our story, France's economy was the second largest and second fastest growing economy in Europe. This not only created a demand for labor that many Jews could fill, but it also encouraged them to migrate more evenly throughout the country. That said, the new laws did meet some resistance. In Alsace, for instance, many public schools continued to refuse admittance to Jewish children. But it was precisely the establishment of the consistories that enabled the Jewish community to alert the government to this discrimination and combat it in the civil courts. While Austria was the first European country to emancipate Jews, it was France and Napoleon who weaponized it, proved its efficacy, and exported it back across Europe. And with that, we return to a continent at war. Prior to Napoleon's rise to power, the revolutionary French government had actively encouraged political dissidents to emigrate to France and its sister republics from the land formerly known as Poland. During the Italian campaign, many veterans of the Kosciuszko uprising had reunited to form the Polish legions, who counted among their ranks none other than Colonel Berek Yoselowicz. The Italian campaign had reignited Yoselowicz's hopes for a restored Poland, fighting alongside the French and Italians from the Trebia to Austerlitz. Finally, after overrunning Prussia in 1807, Napoleon was able to re-establish a Polish state, the Duchy of Warsaw. On the 5th of May 1809, Yoselowicz died in the Battle of Kotsk, a small but decisive battle that led to the doubling of Warsaw's territory. But this was only the beginning of the duchy's ambitions to restore the former Commonwealth. Over the next 3 years, Napoleon further expanded the size of the French Empire, but only on paper. His constant warring, and especially his effort to coordinate a European trade embargo against Britain, had seriously compromised his once unshakable authority over the continent. Finally, in 1812, the Russian Empire, which had long opposed the restoration of Poland, broke its alliance with France, leading France to invade. 4 days after Napoleon's crossing into Russian territory, the Sejm of Warsaw declared the restoration of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 3 days after that, Napoleon declared a provisional government under French and Polish administration in occupied Lithuania, and wherever the French army encountered a Jewish community, they were cheered as liberators. In 1804, while the rest of Europe was expanding Jewish rights, Emperor Alexander I had issued the Regulation on the Settlement of Jews. Although the regulation guaranteed and even expanded existing rights for Jews in cities, it outright forbid Jews from owning businesses in rural villages and imposed severe penalties on non-Jewish landlords who tolerated their presence, commencing a prolonged and often violent campaign to clear hundreds of thousands of Jews from rural areas. By now, tens of thousands of dispossessed Jews crowded into cities like Vilnius, only to be greeted by Napoleon's army and the promise of emancipation. Emperor Alexander could not have created better conditions for a Jewish uprising, and as a result, the French cause was embraced by every single Jewish leader not only in Lithuania, but across the entire Pale of Settlement. Except for one. Although he had long distinguished himself from other Hasidic leaders by advocating for worldliness and intellectualism, Rabbi Shneor Zalman, the last of the great shepherds of the Jewish 18th century, had long decried the supposed virtues of Jewish emancipation. Even after a brief imprisonment by Russian authorities for unproven allegations of assisting France, his loyalty to Alexander was absolute.
Should Napoleon be victorious, wealth among the Jews will be abundant, and the glory of the children of Israel will be exalted. But the hearts of Israel will be separated and distant from their Father in heaven. But if our master Alexander will triumph, though poverty will be abundant and the glory of Israel will be humbled, the heart of Israel will be bound and joined with the Father in heaven. And for God's sake, burn this letter.
Over the previous 4 decades, his Chabad movement had grown to dominate Hasidic Judaism. But in his opposition to Napoleon, he was alone. Instead, he used Chabad loyalists to spy on his fellow Jews for the emperor, who promised to end the rural clearances if Napoleon was defeated. Shneor Zalman died that December, as Napoleon's rapidly disintegrating army abandoned Lithuania. Emperor Alexander made no pretense of honoring his promise. The rural clearances continued. Over the next 2 years, seemingly all of Europe turned against Napoleon, chased him all the way back to Paris, twice, and appeared poised to reverse all of the progress which had emanated from that city since the storming of the Bastille 25 years earlier. In the Papal States, Pope Pius VII restored absolute rule, unemancipated the Jews, and confined them once more to the ghettos to be treated as his personal property, a reaction which he believed would secure the Church's authority over central Italy for centuries to come. The Austrian Empire, which had been the first in Europe to implement emancipation, now abolished it. Although Austrian Jews were not confined to ghettos, and those who had previously acquired land and titles of nobility were allowed to keep them, the arch-conservative foreign minister and later chancellor Clemens von Metternich saw any and all political reforms as a slippery slope to revolution, even when those reforms had predated the revolution. In truth, the only major power that continued to uphold Jewish emancipation to its fullest extent was France. And for this, we can thank one man. By 1808, Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, a man who had been present at the very birth of the French Revolution and advised Napoleon for years, had grown disillusioned with the emperor's warmongering and wary of his eventual defeat. As a result, Talleyrand defected to France's enemies in the hope that they would see the necessity in maintaining the existence of a strong French state. See, in one very specific way, Napoleon had been right. A people once liberated will not easily be returned to the ghetto. Not Jews, not anyone. Even with Napoleon gone, there would continue to be revolutions. and European politics would remain consumed in a battle between liberalism and absolutism. So while the Bourbon dynasty would be restored, constitutionalism, elections, citizenship, and religious toleration were not to be touched. And this is why we remember France. Because although it was not the first country in Europe to emancipate the Jews, it was the first to keep that promise. Through revolution and terror and dictatorship and empire and foreign occupation, France had normalized Jewish civil rights. And while they may have been the last great power standing in that regard, the rest of Europe's Jews would not forget her legacy. The age of emancipation, the age of revolution, had only just begun. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskind, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and Sergei Gerasimov.